Good evening. On behalf of Gary Tintereau, our director, and the Board of Trustees, I would like to welcome you to the second lecture of the 44th Annual Ruth K. Startles Lecture Series. My name is Kaylin Haverstock-Weber, and I'm Associate Curator of American Painting and Sculpture here at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, as well as the organizing curator of the Houston presentation of Norman Rockwell, American Freedom. The Ruth K. Startles Lectures were established in 1975 by Alice Pratt Brown, a major museum benefactor, in memory of her friend, Ruth K. Startles, who was also a longtime museum benefactor. William C. Agee, then director of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, described the lectures as a commemoration of Ruth Startles' unstinting friendship, her intellectual curiosity, and generous support and of sharing her enthusiasm for man's creative accomplishment. And most of all, her unselfish, fresh spirit and unfailing joy of life. Each year, the Startles Lecture Series celebrates one of the museum's major exhibitions or key areas of the museum's collection. All of the Startles series are fully funded by the Brown Foundation. In the spring of this year, the 43rd Ruth K. Startles Lecture Series celebrated the exhibition Vincent van Gogh, His Life and Art. So what better a subject for the 2019-2020 Startles Lecture Series than the groundbreaking exhibition Norman Rockwell, American Freedom? Organized by the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, Norman Rockwell American Freedom is the first comprehensive exhibition devoted to Norman Rockwell's iconic depictions of the four freedoms, outlined originally by President Franklin Roosevelt in his January 1941 address to Congress. The exhibition features Rockwell's freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from fear, and freedom from want, and explores how these paintings came to be embraced by millions of Americans. These works of art provided crucial aid to the war effort and took their place among the most indelible images in the history of American art. This exhibition has traveled internationally and domestically, and we are the fifth of 7 venues. As an institution, this exhibition is unprecedented, as it is the first extensive presentation of the work of Norman Rockwell in the Museum of Fine Arts Houston's 100-year history. This exhibition would not have been possible without our generous funders, so thank you to our lead funder, the Hamill Foundation, as well as MD Anderson Foundation, Melza and Ted Barr, Memorial Herman, John Now III, Susie and Mel Glasscock, Carla Knobloch, the Radoff family, Ann Trammell, Harper and Kelly Trammell, and Flo McGee. Accompanying the exhibition is also a contemporary response titled The Four Freedoms Reimagined, a selection of images from the Four Freedoms photography project by Hank Willis Thomas, Emily Schur, Eric Goetzman, and Wyatt Gallery. This reimagining of Rockwell's paintings is in the exhibition space in an adjacent gallery. Tonight, our distinguished Startles speaker is the historian and author, Dr. Douglas Brinkley, whose topic will be the Four Freedoms, Franklin D. Roosevelt's Vision of America. Dr. Brinkley is the Catherine T. Brown Chair in Humanities and Professor of History at Rice University, the CNN Presidential Historian, and a contributing editor at Vanity Fair. He works in many capacities in the world of public history, including on boards, museums, colleges, and historical societies. The Chicago Tribune dubbed him America's new past master. The New York Historical Society has chosen Brinkley as their official U.S. presidential historian. His recent book, Cronkite, won the Sperber Prize, while the Great Deluge, Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans, and the Mississippi Gulf Coast received the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. He has also received a Grammy for Presidential Suite and 7 honorary doctorates in American Studies. He is a member of the Century Association, Council of Foreign Relations, and the James Madison Council of the Library of Congress. Following Dr. Brinkley's talk tonight, everyone is invited to join us in the law building lobby immediately above the auditorium for a reception and a book signing of his book, Rightful Heritage, Franklin D. Roosevelt and the Land of America. And we'll have entertainment provided by the harpist, Susanna Campbell. Now, please help me in welcoming Dr. Brinkley to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaylin. She is a remarkable ambassador for the Fine Arts Museum. You really are terrific. And we took a tour of the Norman Rockwell exhibit, and thank you for that. It was special. And on the front row, my wife Ann is here with me tonight. So Ann, can you just wave, say hi before I get going? Rice is over. Meaning I was teaching this semester. Classes just ended. Impeachment's over temporarily. So I get a breather from CNN. And I was very excited to come and talk to you about Franklin D. Roosevelt. I'm on the board of the Presidential Library, the Roosevelt Library up in Hyde Park, New York. And I spend my summers up at Hyde Park. And when I was very young, I wrote a book related to the Four Freedoms on FDR and the creation of the United Nations, because from the Four Freedoms I'm going to talk about in a moment, grew the whole idea of the Atlantic Charter between Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, and then from that the creation of the UN. But I thought what might be most useful is to contemplate Winston Churchill calling Franklin D. Roosevelt the greatest person he ever knew. And why would Churchill say such a statement? Besides the obvious that there's a man named Warren Kimball who teaches in South Carolina, did a big 3-volume history of the Roosevelt-Churchill letters. It's a remarkable friendship. But in many ways, FDR is the indispensable person of the 20th century. And the Four Freedoms speech is his indispensable speech, which we need now more than ever. As mentioned, he gave that speech on January 6, 1941. Imagine what the world was like right then. World War II was unraveling in Europe. Hitler and fascism was on the march. The United States, of course, hadn't entered the war. We wouldn't until 11 months later with Pearl Harbor. But FDR was determined to write from the heart a reason of what we believe in as Americans. I grew up, as many of you in the audience, in the Cold War, where people were anti-communist. Roosevelt was such a sunny optimist that he truly always wanted to frame things in a positive. And so he wasn't anti-fascism. Of course he was. But what he wanted to market was pro-democracy, that I'm the representative of democracies around the world. And it's this extraordinary moment late in the evening on the second floor of the White House when FDR starts pausing with it. He had a stenographer with him and writing this Four Freedoms speech. It was noted that he would stay quiet for a while, and then suddenly it came to him. And its simplicity, in some ways, is almost overwhelming. He talked about the first freedom, the freedom of speech and expression, of being our best defense against the corruption of democracy. He spoke of freedom of worship and against bigotry and intolerance everywhere in the world. He spoke about freedom from want, the commitment to solving world hunger and poverty and pestilence, wiping it out from earth as an American objective, and freedom from fear, where nobody had to go to bed in America or anywhere in the world where they were worried about being arrested or beaten, like was happening to Jews and Slavs and others in Europe due to Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich roundups. And he delivered this speech, and it just stays eternal, because the idea of what we're for, what does America mean? And I mentioned the Atlantic Charter meeting. after Roosevelt gives the Four Freedoms speech in January, it's only 7 months later that he goes up to Newfoundland and meets secretly with Winston Churchill. You know, in those days, FDR had a body double. He was in a wheelchair, but they were so worried about him being assassinated, they had a body double, and they did a great espionage kind of hiding stunt where when they showed Roosevelt going sailing and fishing with a body double, so reporters could see what looked like FDR out in the ocean, where meanwhile he was snuck a different way out of the United States and went up to Canada and met Churchill for the first time. And the Atlantic Charter is the beginning of the United States' commitment into World War II. But the big thing, they got along fabulously and all of that, but Roosevelt was still dealing with isolationists in Congress. He couldn't convince enough Americans to go to war against Hitler. The Atlantic Charter it's just a press release saying the United States and Britain have a lot of shared values. It wasn't as big a deal in the United States as it was in London, because Churchill took that press release and America, the Yanks are coming. Happy days are going to be here soon. We're going to be able to fight against Adolf Hitler. I got to once hold the only signed copy of the Atlantic Charter, where a man named, who was in the Navy, his last name's Elsley, was a naval aide to FDR, sitting on a ship in Argentia Bay and had the press release. And he asked FDR to sign one. And then later he got Churchill to sign it. And he just died a year ago. He had in his private possession the only signed copy of the Atlantic Charter. But those are the beginnings of what America's doing in World War II. The Four Freedoms, followed by the Atlantic Charter, and then Roosevelt's vision for a post-World War world dealing with the United Nations. But before I want to just explain to you, as somebody who's written about him, who FDR is. I mean, we all realize that he's a 19th century person born in the 1880s up in Hyde Park, New York. I don't know, have anybody here been to Hyde Park? Quite a few. Great site. They just redid the presidential library there. It's the only presidential site. You can go to the home where FDR was born, where he lived his life, and he's buried on the property. He was a tree farmer by occupation. You know, some of you put what your job is. When he'd fill out occupation, he wrote tree farmer throughout his life. In fact, he used to sell Christmas trees in the New York Times with ads having New Deal Christmas and send people trees from his tree farm up there. In fact, European allies all got trees shipped from FDR. And if you go up to Hyde Park now, they're rebuilding the Roosevelt Forest as a scientific forestry project along the Hudson River there at Hyde Park. The other thing about the birth of FDR is his love of the Hudson River. Where I'm in a great one of my, I just love this museum, and but you know who really influenced FDR and his family were these Hudson River Valley painters, where they were taking the Hudson and making it an idyllic landscape up there. And the paintings were all, go all over there, and the great, Cole and the others are just down really the road from FDR. And so his backyard was the Hudson River. Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife, used to say that the Hudson is the lifeblood of my husband. And in letters, FDR would write about the river. He was so connected to the movements and the moods of that extraordinary body of water that starts as a trickle in the Adirondack Mountains and then, of course, leads us to New York City and Manhattan. His childhood, he was very pampered. His father, James, had married a younger woman, so FDR had a step brother that was considerably older than him. And in photos of Franklin Roosevelt, it's a little embarrassing in some ways because his mother kept him in dresses all the way up until getting ready to go to what today would be middle school age. He had long locks, and she so maybe overmothered him in some ways. She didn't ever want to let him go. It was her little Franklin. And you know, when he eventually went to Harvard, he had been a very sheltered child. But I was able to discover in writing about him that they would do basically what we call today homeschooling. And she would take him into all of the best lectures in New York and make him write what he just heard. I've seen files, for example, at the Museum of Natural History on birds and volcanoes of Hawaii. And she would hold him to a very strict amount of, academic studies. But by the time he goes to Harvard, he has two great loves, maybe three: the U.S. Navy, naval history, naval prints, anything nautical, forest and trees, and as I said, a professional scientific forester, and a love of who he called Uncle Theodore Roosevelt, even though that was his fifth cousin. I should tell you out of the gate, if you want to understand FDR, you got to do research on TR, because Theodore Roosevelt had been a legislator. Well, Theodore Roosevelt's from New York State. FDR's from New York State. Theodore Roosevelt was in the state legislature in Albany. FDR was in the state legislature at Albany. Theodore Roosevelt was governor of New York. FDR was governor of New York. Theodore Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. FDR was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Theodore Roosevelt loved big Navy and forestry and natural parks and resources. FDR loves the Navy and natural resources. Theodore Roosevelt had a niece named Eleanor Roosevelt, and FDR married her. And when we're looking at the 20th century, it's this extraordinary family, the Roosevelts. Ken Burns done a great job on that, but the power of Eleanor Roosevelt as a figure alone. David Ignatius, who writes a column for the New York Times, the Washington Post is about to come out with a big new biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. But when I mention, guys, this notion of forestry and the like and the big Navy, FDR was on a political role early as a Democrat. What differentiated him from FDR from Theodore was that Theodore Roosevelt was ostensibly a Republican. But there were perks having that. When he's going to school, he's got the President of the United States as Theodore Roosevelt, and your name Roosevelt. That's a lot to that, and meaning people wanting to already expect quite a bit out of Franklin. He was really, in the end, a C.B. student with an incredibly amiable personality, was extraordinarily handsome, which we forget about, but when you look at young photographs of him, you could see he's almost a magazine model. And he ended up going in after getting involved with New York politics, this big moment in World War I where he got chosen to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And it was Joseph Thesis Daniels from North Carolina was the Secretary of the Navy, and he was infirmed. So during World War I, FDR was really running the Navy at a young age. And Theodore Roosevelt had written the best 2-volume history of the naval battles of the War of 1812. And Theodore Roosevelt was legendary in Navy history. And if you went to and during World War I, FDR's office in the Navy Department, it's just ship models and prints and memorabilia from the Hudson River. And almost daily, he's talking about tree plantings and how to, continue to build the family farm. Keep in mind, if I leave you with one thing to understand about FDR, he's from rural New York. I think when people say FDR's from New York, we're like, oh, New York City's a New Yorker. There's a giant difference between New York City and upstate. FDR's constituents were farmers, tulip planters, loggers, fisher folk, Catskill arts and crafts people, agriculture and farming. He was a country squire in the real sense of the word. He was always more interested in being in a natural setting than in a big city. That's why he always sat his whole life on the Hudson River up there. In Dutchess County, New York, Eleanor, without exaggeration, said he knows every nook, cranny, eddy, rock, anything in that county. He's one of these people, and I've gotten to know Jimmy Carter well, who's that way with Plains, Georgia. Carter knows every single thing in Sumter County. A man named William Least Heat Moon did a book called Prairie Earth, a big fat book on one county, in Nebraska. And that's the way FDR looked at the world from that Dutchess County rural perspective. And beyond being working in the Navy in World War I, his other big thing was constantly promoting upstate tourism. You're living in New York City, come on up, because the automobile now allowed people to do day trips and weekends and camp. Go visit West Point, go to Saratoga Battlefield, go do a Catskill camp out, because that was money for his district up there. Where people like Robert Caro wrote the great book about Robert Moses in New York. Moses wanted people to go to Jones Beach, places nearby. FDR was saying, come upstate. He's a quintessential upstate politician, FDR, not a New York City man at heart. Now, during World War I, he became so famous with his job at the Navy and worked hard, did well, that in 1920, FDR was chosen with James Cox of Ohio to run as the VP. So in 1920, the ticket was Cox and Roosevelt. Roosevelt was running, that he had been in legislature in New York and was the big Navy background and was young. Women got to vote for the first time in 2020, white women, by and large. This summer, when you're at Milwaukee with the Democratic Convention or Charlotte with the Republicans, it should be a year of women in the sense that we're celebrating 100 years of the fulfillment of the Seneca Falls movement and women's right to vote. But in 1920, he ran, and he did well. The newspaper reports, was all about two Ohioans, Cox from Ohio versus Warren Harding. But as VP nominee, he got a lot of good press. But of course, as you know, Warren Harding won. And you have 3 Republican presidents in a row with Warren Harding and then Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover. But the star of FDR was looking good in 1920, but he had lost. So exactly at Christmas of 1920, in that November they lost. He was at Hyde Park. He was selling his Christmas trees. The World War I was over. He had no job except his tree plantation. And he was thinking, what should I do for 2021? And the answer was the Boy Scouts, because Theodore Roosevelt was the big godfather, progenitor, and of the Boy Scouts. And FDR said, I'm going to spend my year doing something novel. And there incidentally is a 1935 artwork illustration about the Boy Scouts coming to Washington when FDR is president, a commission for Norman Rockwell that I hope you take a look at. And so Roosevelt's idea for the Boy Scouts is, I'm going to take urban city kids from Paterson, New Jersey, from Queens, from Brooklyn, from Trenton, but basically the greater metropolitan New York area. And all kids are going to get a free upstate camping vacation called a Boy Scout Jamboree. And we're all going, all expenses paid. You're going to get to spend a week at Bear Mountain State Park on the Hudson. And he was the grand impresario. He fundraised for it. All these kids got on a steamer boat going up the Hudson to Bear Mountain. And Roosevelt there spent all this time in the summer of 1921 for the big ceremony. He went canoeing. He went fishing. They did, hot dog roast, marshmallows, the whole bit. And he also went swimming with the Boy Scouts. And he swam in contaminated water, and he contracted the polio virus. A number of the Boy Scouts came down with polio. The sewage system at that point in America, all over America, was horrific. But They had clean water problems at the state parks of New York. And that it doesn't manifest itself, polio, for a few days. And he was up at Campobello, New Brunswick, the border of Maine and New Brunswick, when he went out with his kids sailing. They stomped around a little islet. They actually put out a forest fire on an island that day. He thought the smoke had burned his eyes. He came back. He had a migraine headache. He went to bed early. He read every night, and this is the night he didn't read. And he was laying in bed miserable. And by the time the daylight came, he had zero feeling in the lower half of his body. And the man that we all know that, and we're honoring for freedoms of freedom from fear, was in utter fear for himself. He was turned dark and screaming and didn't know what to do. And Eleanor Roosevelt was there at his side, like a Florence Nightingale-like figure. They were able to transport him eventually to New York City, to the best hospital, where it was declared that he had polio. And he gets put back at his home in Hyde Park, New York there. And you know what? Nobody wanted to be with FDR. People back then were afraid you can catch polio from being near somebody. So you didn't want to hug Franklin Roosevelt. You didn't want to touch his sweat. You didn't want to be in his orbit. And you'd be amazed when you're struck with polio. Suddenly the guy in 1920, Christmas 1920, was the VP nominee for president. Now it's Christmas 21 and nobody visits him. He sat there and he would say, the woodchucks on my property were my friends and the birds I've spent my life. He was a real ornithologist, Audubon being one of his great boyhood heroes. And he had, Eleanor Roosevelt had gotten involved with women's issues and labor issues, traveled a lot. And he would sit there with nobody coming to see him. And in his dark hour at Hyde Park, he asked the same question. What did Theodore Roosevelt do when he had his big obstacle, tragedy in life? Theodore Roosevelt lost his mother and wife on the same Valentine's Day in New York. They died in the same house. One of Bright's disease, and his mom died of Bright's disease, a failure of kidneys, and his wife Alice died in childbirth. She had like 105 fever, like blew up the thermometer. And he was shuttling between two floors, Theodore Roosevelt, when both died. And he put in his diary, TR, historians read other people's diaries and mails for a living. One of the darkest I've ever seen is Theodore Roosevelt, the day he lost his wife and mother, put a giant X. You can almost feel the pen cutting the page through it and said, my light has gone out of my life forever. And Theodore Roosevelt went and got lost in the wilderness of the Dakota territories. His sisters said, Theodore, get west, go out, heal yourself, heal your soul. And so FDR now, remembering how the outdoors was recuperative for TR during his melancholy days, ended up calling up his neighbor in Hyde Park, who was the top ornithologist in New York State, upstate New York, not in Manhattan, there were better ones. But they together decided, we're going to go see if the thermal waters of Florida help you. And so FDR goes and lives on a glass-bottom boat down in Florida in the Everglades and and went through the Florida Keys, trying to go in the water and seeing if it had some kind of recuperative power. He had chronic sinus issues his entire life, and the sun and fresh salt air would kind of clear up. Today we have all these pills and sprays and procedures, but he unfortunately suffered chronically with that too. And they went down there to take a bird count. Who could find the most birds? An Audubon checklist. And they had a competition. And at one point, FDR writes, I'm afraid I'm losing the bird competition because I can't go anywhere. I have to just sit on the boat while they get to go on land looking for them. And he just disappears for months. And one letter, incidentally, and it's a tangential side note, but he wrote that someday we have to save the Everglades as a national park, and as president, he saved the Everglades as a national park. But he then went back to New York and then went back to Florida. And he decided what he was going to do with the rest of his life was try to deal with thermal waters, spring waters, and bought a resort for people with polio in Warm Springs, Georgia, because that was the only people that were comfortable around him. Everybody else was worried if he coughed or sneezed or, it was such a curse, polio. We're here with fellow, and they would call them polios. There with fellow polios, you could swim and hug and play chess. And it's a little resort, but the Native Americans in Georgia had considered it a kind of spiritual place too for healing. And Roosevelt was a resort owner and runner in the 1920s. His big side project was state parks. He ended up being the leader of the state park movement, and as president from 1933 to 1945, Franklin D. Roosevelt created over 800 state parks, including most of our state parks here in Texas. Whether you go to Balmoral or the parks at Big Bend, he creates Big Bend National Park here in Texas, FDR, on June 6, 1944, D-Day. Because Amon Carter, have any of you been to the Amon Carter Museum, Fort Worth, your art people here? Amon Carter, on D-Day, FDR spent the days before in Charlottesville, Virginia, bird watching, because he didn't want the press to think something dramatic was happening. But he showed up on the 5th to keep kind of routine meetings so nobody smelled anything big happening. And on June 6th, right after he gives his prayer to the nation on D-Day, he spent hours on maps of how to create Big Bend National Park here in Texas, and got it established on June 6, 1944. Eventually tried to make it a giant national park shared between Mexico and the United States. And during the middle of the war was lobbying the Mexican government, can we do a kind of biologically intact park along the Rio Grande? But the moment in the 20s, besides working on parks and roads, he designed the freeways up to New York that don't have billboards, the Taconic Parkway. FDR designed all of that. He went with his polio. He had a driver, and they would figure out how to do that road, again, to bring people from New York City, Westchester, upstate with ease to enjoy the natural wonders. But his big moment, he was forgotten, guys. You could just look up these years in the New York Times index, and he's barely mentioned. There are a couple articles, one about Warm Springs and what happened to him, but he's just not in the mix of any real way. And suddenly Al Smith, the first Catholic candidate for president of the United States as a Democrat, invited FDR to introduce him at the major speech in Madison Square Gardens in New York. And FDR said yes, and he trained for that speech like an athlete. He would have he would have these bars out at Hyde Park at his home and push all the pressure on each arm. And then he would try to move his hips, and then he'd have a son hold onto an arm where he could push. And he built up quite an upper body strength. His legs became like spaghetti. They barely, he lost flesh even around. His legs were essentially non-existent for him after a while, the deterioration. But he had done weights to build up his arms. Hence, if you go down on Port Aransas here in Texas, that National Wildlife Refuge TR created, he was fishing there for tarpon and things to show, his upper body strength pulling in big fish. So he trained and trained and trained. And suddenly the day came in Madison Square Gardens. And just to get from the exit sign where I'm at, Franklin D. Roosevelt, he had trained this very awkward kind of thing, and he had a son to lean on when he started falling. And if you were in the audience, you're like, oh my God, he's about to fall. And there's no way, so the whole place got hushed. And then he told his son, good enough, and he just clung and had learned how to put the pressure to hold the podium. And he gave an amazing speech, and he got an over 1 hour standing ovation. And the next day's newspapers said, move over, Al Smith, FDR's back, the new rising star of Franklin D. Roosevelt. I teach here at Rice Presidential History. It's seldom as a speech galvanized a career like that did. I mean, Ronald Reagan gave one at that called A Time for Choosing in 1964 at Barry Goldwater's, being nominated for the Republican Party, which kind of catapulted Reagan also. But now FDR was a pretty hot ticket, and suddenly, things are Republican-generated money, big business in the 20s, and then boom, we have the stock market crash. And when the stock market crashed in 1929, FDR, we all immediately think of banks foreclosing, can't get your money out, homeless people, no jobs. All this concerned Franklin Roosevelt, but his big concern had become the farmers of America who were suffering from misuse of the land, drought, no scientific crop rotation. I mean, we had dead land here in America. It's not just the Dust Bowl through Oklahoma and Texas. It's all over the United States. We had deforested all of our hardwood forests, and we had shot up the game of North America. And Roosevelt kicks into gear trying to think of ideas how to help rural farmers around first New York and the country. And he runs for governor of New York and wins in 1928. And and then in 1930, he runs again and wins 2-year terms. 2-term New York governor while the Republican Party's crashing and burning cause of the Great Depression. And they do a wonderful job here of some just stunningly heartbreaking photography of the Great Depression and poverty of that era. And Roosevelt's keeping his eyes on poor rural people around the country. And he had learned radio. None of you will remember the voice of radio of Calvin Coolidge. He gave speeches, so did Herbert Hoover. But Roosevelt learned how to project in a way that broke through on radio. I mentioned I wrote a biography of Walter Cronkite, and Cronkite once told me when I interviewed him that the big thing in television was how do you break through the glass? It's not always people you think. Some people can come right to you through TV and others can't. And Roosevelt's voice broke through radio like really, certainly no other politician. So he decides to run for 1932 for the president of the United States. And back then, governor of New York was a big deal. I mean, Andrew Cuomo is a big deal today, but not like this. This was before the things have shifted to Texas and Florida and the Sun Belt and California. Before we had commercial aviation, things were still a train. And so New York was the center of everything. And Roosevelt's big thing that he did as governor of New York was take unemployed, homeless people and young people or people in hard luck situations, pay them $1 a day to give them the dignity of work and have them work and come together and then set up civilian conservation corps camps all over America. The idea was to build art museums, to create public squares, to build gardens, and to do roads, but particularly to plant trees. From 1930, when he becomes president, building on this pilot project he did in New York, it really worked. I mean, it was stunning. It seems odd when Roosevelt came up with the idea, and this is his own idea, the CCC. It's sort of an extension of the Boy Scouts when you think about it. But what he's saying is, and the key, so to stop moral depravity of young men, they had to send, like, out of every $1 they earned a day, 75 cents or went to their parents. So you would send money back home to help the homestead. You'd have to be up at bugle call. And then he created at these CCC camps what are like community colleges, vocational training. So you learn to use a blowtorch, or you learn how to use a saw, or you learn how to plant trees. And he runs in 1932 under the banner of the New Deal for America, and his belief that in an activist government, and his belief in optimism. The main word with FDR is optimism. His connection to God is very intense. He was not he was a churchgoer regularly, but he had created a relationship with the Creator. We can't find FDR getting angry. Here's somebody in a wheelchair who can't walk, who every day he woke up with this sort of sunny optimism. And that was the medicine he felt the country needed, love and belief in ourselves. And so he started, as you know, when he beat Herbert Hoover at his famous inaugural address, and inaugural addresses used to be in March. It's a more recent development this January, got moved. But during FDR, you'd be in March inaugurals. And that's when he gave the famous speech, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. And that word fear plays into the one of the four freedoms, the freedom from fear. But we can do it. Pull together, communities pull together. Remarkable inaugural address. Some people think it's certainly among the best 3 or 4. Lincoln's are pretty special, and obviously George Washington's first inaugural. But in modern times, there's nothing like 1933. And the drama is he's in a wheelchair, can't talk. And in those days, we were so polite in America, people wouldn't photograph him as handicapped. It was considered gauche. So we only have like 2 photos of FDR in his wheelchair taken sneakily taken from a back, but just that's it. Because press said, no, that's unfair play. And it just tells you how times have changed. But Roosevelt, when it starts with those CCC camps, it's really the most exciting in my mind of the early New Deal ones. And from 1933 to 1942, these unemployed men and women, lesser women, but the women's were called she camps. But they plant over 3 billion trees. Billion trees around America. All over the trees to start the reforestation of America. And FDR immediately declares 1934 the year of national parks. He goes all the way to Hawaii for the national park. He goes to Glacier in Montana and does a radio broadcast about saving the parks. He ended up, I mentioned to you, Big Bend in the Everglades, but pick 'em, Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, or Channel Island and in Santa Barbara, California, or Isle Royale up in Michigan, on and on and on. Like TR, he's saving natural places. They're then building state parks as green zones around everywhere. There's a sense of beautification of urban scapes. And it just becomes a remarkable program, the CCC, because it took idle people that could have been in, particularly young people in urban centers with no money, could have led to violence, but by giving them meaningful employment in such a way, and healing and pulling America together. I don't have time to tell you about the alphabet soup of the New Deal, as we call it. There are just so many agencies created in the 1930s. You all know, I'm sure, 99% of you, that FDR is remarkable in presidential history. He's winning 4 times. We have to get a constitutional amendment to stop FDRism after he died. But he created he won in 1932, he won in 1936, he won in 1940, and he won in 1944. Many Americans never knew what it was like to not have Roosevelt as president of the United States. And his secrets to his success in his elections was he used his automobile. They devised a contraption, and he would drive all over America. And he particularly would drive in rural counties to talk to farmers. And suddenly there'd be the president pulling up next to you, asking you how you're doing. And he did this as like in a religious way almost. And of course, he kept the home in Georgia. So even though he's a New Yorker, he had a residency in the state of Georgia, so he can deal with Southern issues and the like. Meanwhile, Eleanor Roosevelt just shatters the mold of what a first lady should be. I do the polls for C-SPAN where we rank presidents, and it's usually Lincoln first, and there's a marvelous Abraham Lincoln portrait, here in the exhibit of Lincoln as lawyer defending somebody charged for murder. And Norman Rockwell really enjoyed trying to capture the facial features of Lincoln in that particular era. But when it comes to, so you could say Lincoln and George Washington and FDR's third. You can make an argument for FDR number one, incidentally, but he's the big three American presidents. But when it comes to first ladies, there's like Eleanor Roosevelt and everybody else. She was stunning in the work that she did for women's rights, for civil rights, for human rights. It's the spirit of the four freedoms is Eleanor Roosevelt. But both of them had a great love of people, and they had no sense of, there wasn't a kind of innate snobbery with them, even though they grew up aristocrats. During Roosevelt's sense of foreign policy, the big thing Eleanor would say about FDR is, they say my husband's not an intellectual. They don't realize Franklin has a map mind. He collected postage stamps and loved illustrated works like Norman Rockwell. He loved the illustrated postage stamps of the world. Some of you have your house, God forbid, caught on fire or something. What would you go for? You kind of grab family photos or some family heirlooms. FDR would have been his postage stamp books. He carried them everywhere with him. He would even design, as president, postage stamps, illustrate stamps. And he started rebuilding the post office movement around the country to have art murals. Beyond the forestry part, you have the WPA artist and writers and trying to give unemployed artist jobs all across the money, people like Ben Shahn and many others. The problem that they get with all of those, I think the big one that's lasting, that's affecting your life is Social Security. It's kind of one of those odd things that, like, all of us here tonight know our Social Security number probably. And it's like, we don't think how odd that is, that we got dubbed a number that we all know, that's our identity. And how Roosevelt created Social Security is one of the most remarkable stories. Again, how do you take care of the elderly? How do you take care of people that get sickness and don't have the money to afford it? And his genius was making the American people pay into it. All of you have paid into Social Security. You don't want it taken away from you now because you've been paying into it. And so it got everybody involved in a way that's still quite astounding. But the drumbeat of war is there during his presidency. Japan, in the empire, is challenging the United States. Theodore Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize for mediating the Russian-Japanese War, our first president to win a Nobel, TR. But during the 1930s, there were problems in the Pacific, and I don't have to tell you about what's going on with Hitler in Europe. And it's sad, but Roosevelt was preaching democracy and internationalism and fighting against isolationists. The big isolationists were people like Henry Ford, the great automaker, and Charles Lindbergh. They saw Nazi Germany and they liked the efficiency of it, the superhighways, the factories, and all this. Roosevelt, FDR, and Eleanor are the biggest opponents of fascism you would ever see. One of the great folk singer, Woody Guthrie, used to work on a New Deal program. And on Guthrie's guitar that he wrote, "This Land Is Your Land" on, it says, "This machine kills fascist." Music and popular sentiments, folk songs, it's that it gets it's almost like a sermon music to get people's spirits going. And Roosevelt did what he could to get America involved in the war, or to stop the rise of Hitler and Tojoism in the Pacific. But alas, he recognized by the time after he won the 1940 election and beat Republican Wendell Willkie, and that January 6th of 1941, he knew that he had to do something to pull everybody together to say, what do we mean as Americans? What is it? And those become his famous For Freedom speech. The speech, when he delivered it, did well. It got, Capitol Hill liked it. It became well known, but it's grown since its delivery, particularly because of Norman Rockwell. Those are some of Rockwell's most iconic works of art. And it captures a kind of raw democracy. Some of them are just, heartbreaking in the sense of looking at little kids going to bed, not having fear at night. The Thanksgiving turkey, type, and the food for not having want that people around the world can eat. Humane principles that we're fighting for freedom and decency all over the world. And the Four Freedoms grew because we didn't, even though I don't have time tonight to Lend-Lease steel and all of this, by the time of Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, Japan declared war on us. And then Adolf Hitler declared war on us. And so Roosevelt, when he did the famous Day of Infamy speech, we were all in it together. There were some conscientious objectors. There were some people, pacifists that weren't part of the war effort. But you're dealing with a country that's 90% in the end about winning the war. And so our country pulled together and did remarkable things. Nothing like an aroused democracy. Places that I go to places like the Normandy battlefield or the Battle of the Bulge, and I hope in your lives, if you haven't, you get to go. But it's also important to go look at, I saw the Women at Work display with Norman Rockwell, and they just opened a big museum out in Richmond, California for Rosie the Riveter and women in the workforce picking up to help with the war effort in cities like San Diego or Norfolk or Detroit, that we be turned overnight into mass producing things to win World War II. Roosevelt administration was able to go to a company that, let's say, makes trumpets, musical band instruments. And Roosevelt administration would say, look, stop making the trumpets. We need you to make ship valves, but we'll give you a government contract after the war to reconvert back to making your ship valves so it'll be profitable for you. Take that and multiply it by thousands. A company I read about that was making silk blouses for women. Overnight they have to change and make parachutes. And it becomes remarkable. And Roosevelt's other great talent is he knew how to pick people. He was one of the better, it's a secret talent that some people have. He could read who's the best person for the job. His picking in the military world of people like George Marshall and Leahy and Eisenhower, on, Admiral King, perfect for the jobs. His belief in George Marshall. But the other thing about FDR in the New Deal and during World War II, always wanted ideas. Roosevelt's was just, you could never do a cockamamie idea to FDR. His approach was, they used to say, I take 50 ideas, throw them up against the wall and see what will stick. So it got people involved with, like a poet like Archibald MacLeish could come in and come up with an idea for something that get adopted overnight. Or I've written about a woman named Nirvana Hamilton Hoyt, who went and created Joshua Tree National Park. She ran the Pasadena Rose Bowl parade, and she wanted to save these Joshua trees that some people thought were grotesque, but they're actually extraordinary if you've ever been to that park. She had a dream, I'm going to make a 1 million acre park to save these trees. And because she was little known in Pasadena, she got like a 2-minute meeting with President Roosevelt. She showed him photos of the trees, and he said, "Done, you've got your park." And she's like, "Well, no, their railroads have some leases on this part and mines in this part." And he said, "Well, that's what lawyers are for, but it's done. We'll do it. That's beautiful." And that's why you have Joshua Tree National Park today. That open-mindedness is what I'm saying, that he wouldn't hold it against you that if you were trying to have an alternative way of looking at it. So it brought some of our best people into government. And I will tell you 2 quick stories. One involves, to give you an idea of his aesthetic sense and a sense of the natural world. Here we are in the middle of World War II. And he gets a letter from a woman named Rosalie Edge, who was in New York City, and wrote him a very kind of rambling letter that the U.S. Army 10th Mountain Division is at Henry's Lake, Idaho, and it is disturbing trumpeter swans because the lake, Henry's Lake, it doesn't freeze in the winter. And so instead of migrating here to Texas or Louisiana, these beautiful trumpeter swans would stay in a kind of a Yellowstone-like environment up there and on the lake. But when the Army 10th Mountain Division, that cost $25 million to train soldiers for ski patrol and to do dynamiting and things that they would need to do in Europe, it was our Alpine Training Center. She's writing that they need to leave Henry's Lake because it's disturbing the trumpeter swans and that they will go extinct if they in North America, if this sort of because some of the soldiers shot at them and then they would chase them away, all of the ordinances that were going on there. It's a stunning letter. I mean, it's hard to believe. Here's Franklin Roosevelt writing Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson. "Dear Henry, I've now found out about the battle between the trumpeters and the U.S. Army. I have looked into it carefully, and the U.S. Army must re-nest. Sincerely, Franklin D. Roosevelt." And they shut it down to save the trumpeter swans. This is at the time of Pearl Harbor, to save the trumpeters, and they made the U.S. 10th Mountain Division move to Camp Hale, Colorado, because Roosevelt said that what would North America be without trumpeter swans? We've got to save other creatures. That's part of what America is. It's part of what our values are. And that, again, back to that love of land and river and place that he held so deep. And then right in the summer, late in the war, after D-Day and the rest, in the summer of 1945, he hooks up with Gifford Pinchot, the old head chief forester of Theodore Roosevelt, who created the U.S. Forest Service. And Pinchot and Roosevelt wanted to see him. He's now in his 80s and had heart attacks. Was writing his memoir called Breaking New Ground. And FDR said, "Henry, we got to do one last big thing. I'm going to create the United Nations, and here's how we're doing it. And I want to put a provision in the UN that have what today you guys would call global environmental laws to not ruin the planet." And he said that, in conservation of the world is our salvation. And he wanted to market this as a slogan, and started moving to put in when the UN because you can't have one standard of polluting in France, and then Germany does this, and who's poisoning the river and the skies. So he was very visionary in this regard, but it got shot down. I mean, he was pushing it. His health was deteriorating. By the time of February 1945 at Yalta, his best friend died, Pa Watson. Pa was the guy who every day would put on the leg braces, strap them in, and would have to lift him to go to the toilet and things. FDR loved him because he was ranked the lowest of the class at West Point, or like one from the lowest. Everybody brags about, I went to West Point and I'm number 1 or 2. His friend Pa Watson was one of on a lower end, but a wonderful man, Watson, and he died on the voyage back from the Yalta meeting with Stalin and Churchill. And Roosevelt felt very alone with Watson gone. He had raccoon eyes and wearing that cape at Yalta, deciding the fate of the post-World War, including ideas that FDR had of what is today the European Union and a common market for Europe, finding ways to end the war. And he was all about the United Nations at the end of the war. And of course, on April 12, 1945, he died at Warm Springs, Georgia. It's very poignant because he died sitting for somebody painting his portrait. And here we are at a fine art museum, and you can see the half portrait of FDR. He hemorrhaged sitting, posing for the portrait. And they moved his body to a flag-draped coffin to be buried up along the Hudson on the land that he loved so much. People lined the railways, not since Lincoln's assassination at the end of the Civil War was this sort of public mourning for an American leader. And particularly African-American community had learned to adopt the Roosevelts as caring about issues of civil rights in a way other presidents hadn't up to then. But when they buried him there, a lot of them said, we got to do something more. And so when the United Nations got started, it was Harry Truman's president. He dies April 45. In May of 45, it's the birth of the United Nations, San Francisco Conference, Nob Hill, hotel on top of Nob Hill. All the world's foreign ministers and leaders came to create the UN. And before they did, they all took a trip out to Muir Woods, where the giant redwood trees are beautiful old-growth trees in Marin County. And they walked deep into that forest to do a memorial service for FDR around those giant redwood trees to honor how much his whole life was about the tree, the growing of a tree. The idea in a democracy that you plant seeds and it'll grow. It takes time, but we have to, that idea of life that was synonymous with Franklin Roosevelt. His wife keeps going in Eleanor Roosevelt, building on the seminal. When I deal, guys, with foundational documents, they're in the news a lot these days, but the Declaration of Independence or Bill of Rights, Lincoln's inaugural, the Gettysburg Address, Emancipation Proclamation. I also include as foundational text FDR's For Freedom speech and Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. It is that important, the way that FDR bottled up the idea of what America was fighting for in that particular speech. And it goes from the For Freedom speech to the Atlantic Charter to the creation of the UN. And then Eleanor Roosevelt does the final one, which is the UN Declaration for Human Rights, a global human rights standard that is still the global standard for human rights. And her name, Eleanor Roosevelt, is synonymous with human rights. Jimmy Carter's is also, but she's really continued to push for that. She would live on and into 1962, and I would end by telling you, when you see this and look carefully at this show, you can see how much Norman Rockwell and FDR have in common. He really is a New Dealer, Rockwell, a Rooseveltian. This combination of believing in local democracy, the famous, with the voter in a town hall meeting with his jacket and his hat on, and that we're participatory democracy. Yet in the second half of the Rockwell is the great civil rights works, which are stunning here. I think the civil rights work, seeing them together like they're presented here, curated here, it's just remarkable about Norman Rockwell. And these Four Freedoms paintings, and this is the book of Rockwell's Four Freedoms that they in Massachusetts at the Rockwell Museum like to do. When you read that book, I reread it today in preparation for tonight, just thinking about it, getting myself in the mood for it. You realize that, first off, Rockwell's an amazing artist. I think the debate should be over whether he's merely an illustrator. He's remarkable, the amount of detail, vision, sensitivity. And you can see some of the themes there. I've mentioned the Boy Scouts. I've mentioned they're showing what a United Nations would look like. And in the culmination, what FDR didn't get to do was the Civil Rights Act that Lyndon Johnson did in 64 and 65. And you see the continuity of Rockwell from FDR to Lyndon Johnson as somebody who wanted to document our better angels, often loving art, beautiful, joyous art. There's no better show to take kids to than this, because you feel the love of Norman Rockwell, but then you see the dark underbelly on racism and intolerance in the United States. And so it opens up conversations about teaching tolerance and teaching love. And so out of all the presidents I've got to write about, and I've written about many, I've interviewed many. I just a couple weeks ago interviewed Bill Clinton for a while, and I got to know Gerald Ford when he was alive, and all of them. There's nobody quite like FDR to me, not just because of his policies, not because of the crucible of the Depression, World War II, but I remember, my God, if he can suffer and fight with being wheelchair bound and unable to walk, and try to make everybody else's life better, didn't complain. There's a saying FDR liked, that complaints are a bore and a nuisance to all and undermine the serenity essential for endurance. That we have to kind of push ourselves forward and not be whiny, not complain, do things, help people, give a helping hand. And in that way, they're kindred spirits, Norman Rockwell and FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt. And so it's wonderful here before Christmas to get to, in the holidays, to be able to come here to the Fine Arts Museum, one of the best in America, and surely one of the best curated shows I've seen dealing with American history in a long time. So rejoice that you have this extraordinary exhibit here. Thank you.